Ms. Sands, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
All righty. Ms. Sands, do you have a copy of the syllabus online or
Yes.
from email?
Yes, I have it.
All right, we're going to go over that very quick, and then we'll get started in the class. Make sure everybody has no questions, or if you have questions about the syllabus, now it's a good time to talk about it. My name is Mike Underwood, or Michael, but you can call me Mike. Just don't call me late for supper. Required textbook. Well, let's start at the beginning. The students' learning outcomes. The students should become familiar with the purpose of the Old Testament writings as a whole and as individual components. This is an introductory class. This is not a textual study of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so forth. It's an introductory class that will touch on those books. And I'll mention that again later. It's really hard for me not to get involved in the text when we're going through it, but requirement of this course is we're introducing. So that's what we'll do to the best of my ability. The required textbook, Ms. Sands, did you get a copy of that, or were you able to get it online?
Not yet, no, but I will be getting a copy.
Okay, you can just download it from the website that's there. The link that's there, you can bring it up on your computer, and I believe you can save it as a PDF file onto your computer if you want to, or you can just read it online. Either
Okay.
case. Another requirement, and for you, Ms. Sands, this will be a little bit different. The guys here, or the people here, next week and the week after, we're going to look at a DVD from a series called That the World May Know, Volume 8, God Heard Their Cry by Ray Vander Lam. You can order that from Focus on the Family.
Okay.
It costs you $28. There's a book that goes with it. You can purchase it or not. That's up to you. I recommend it, but as far as the course is concerned, you need to get a copy of that DVD because I can't show you that online.
Okay.
It would be a violation of copyright. I've asked him to let me do it, but he's never given me permission. He's never refused it, but he's never given it, so I'm not going to do it.
Okay.
So the next 2 weeks in class, we'll be watching that DVD. It's got, I think, 5 lessons on it that we'll cover in the 2-hour sessions. We will be online next week, but you won't be able to see the video.
Okay.
Okay? So
Okay.
that'll be, if you're taking the class for credit, information from that video will be on the test, as will information from the book, the textbook, be on the test. We will not follow the textbook in class. That's for your extracurricular reading. There won't be any surprises from it, but there will be questions from the textbook on the test. So you'll be responsible for the lectures and for the textbook. And the two will not necessarily follow each other.
Okay.
They won't be opposed to each other, but they won't necessarily follow each other. On the syllabus, I have a writing requirement. You get to choose. I have a term paper of 8 pages, double-spaced, 12 font required for the course. The student may choose from one of the following topics. He may choose a topic of his own interest that must be approved by the instructor before beginning the paper. Don't just start one and not let me know about it because I may not want you to do it. Genesis is a myth, true or false, could be your paper. Who was the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph? When I was first starting out in school, that was the one I chose, so I like it. The significance of the 10 plagues and the 10 commandments. This title does not imply or deny that the two things were connected, but just write me a paper on the significance of the 10 plagues and the 10 commandments. The authorship of Deuteronomy. I don't recommend doing that one, but if you want to go into it, then go for it. Who is the virgin of Isaiah chapter 7? a full-length sermon from the Psalms of your choice, or a full-length sermon from one of the minor prophets of your choice. So pick two of those and give me a term paper on, or two term papers on those. You got 18 weeks. Method of instruction, lectures, videos will be used, but I can't show them online, at least not at this point, because I don't have permission. And the grade evaluation criteria, essays, quizzes, grade will be averaged into one score. That will account for 1/3 of the final grade. A writing assignment, the writing assignment and an essay are two different things. I may give you something I want you to write a couple paragraphs on during the class, not during the class, but as we move along, just to make sure that you're understanding what we're saying. So I'll say, give me an essay on whatever. And when you turn that in, that'll be graded along with any quizzes. A quiz is after class, it's recorded after we finish the class. I'll go home and go over my notes and find out what I said, and then I will send you a quiz to that effect. And the final test will come from those quizzes. So it'll be your study guide.
That's for those who are taking for credit.
I'm sorry?
That's for those who are taking for
If you're
credit.
taking for credit. If you're not taking for credit, none of this matters. You don't have to do any of it to show up. But if you're taking it for credit, and I won't always send you a quiz. Sometimes I just forget. So you get lucky on the one things I forget. I send you a quiz. It's for your good. Just answer the quiz, but it's open notes on your quiz, open book, open Bible, open whatever on the quiz. On the final exam, it's not. So the quizzes will be your study guide. So the writing assignment counts for 1/3 of the grade. The final exam will count for the 1/3 of the grade. So that should give us enough material to grade so that you can have a good grade for the class. On the dates that I have assigned here, August 9, Genesis, August 16, Exodus, August 23 is also Exodus. I won't necessarily stay by that. I'll tell you right off, I'll get behind. I'll do the best I can to cover all of the material. In fact, I'm going to make myself cover all the material, but I may get off a few books here and there, but we'll catch up to the best of our ability. So I've got the dates there of what we'll be covering when, but don't hold me to that. We will cover it,
Okay.
but when may change. And I have over there on the quiz, on the in-class activity, the quizzes and so forth, there'll probably be more quizzes. I just didn't get them put on there. Class policies and procedures, all of the rest of this, I believe, is in your school manual. Everybody have a school manual?
I don't.
Okay, Ms. Sanders will try to get you a copy of that. I think it's online at the GSLP website. But the rest of this is I think from the school manual. I didn't write it. It's just stuff that I copied and put on here to make sure that you're aware of it. And I'm not going to take the time this evening to go over that. Y'all can read that.
The school manual is on GSOP online.
Can't swear to that. I've been told that it is online, but if it's not, we can get you, I think Tommy can get us a hard copy of it. Brother Tidwell can get us a hard copy of it.
Okay.
I've never actually seen the school manual. I copied this from somewhere. That portion of it, I copied that from somewhere. I don't know if it's in the manual or what. But I wanted to make sure it's in the syllabus so that y'all are aware of the school policies. Any questions about the syllabus?
So we need to do 2 term papers.
Yes. You get to choose from those subjects, or if you want to give me a subject of your choosing. One time I got behind in my classes years ago, and I had written a report or essay or something for one class, and I asked the teacher that I was behind in, I said, can I just give you what I wrote for another class? And he said, yes, so I did. So if you have something that you've already written that goes along with this class, I'm not opposed to that, just as long as you have done the work. I won't because it was done as a favor for me one time. I'll do you that favor. If you've already written something that goes along with the subject matter, don't just turn it in, but pass it through me first, and then we'll make a judgment on that. Hello, Vincent.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good.
All right. We've just gone over the syllabus. I'm not going to go back over that. It'll be on the recording for you.
Okay.
So I do want to remind you that next week and the week after, we're going to be going over or using a DVD in class. It's in your syllabus. Do you have a copy of the syllabus?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You need to order that. It's the only thing I'm asking you to pay for. The textbook is free, but you need to order the DVD because I can't show you that in class. It's a violation of copyright. And so those of you who are online have to pay to purchase the DVD.
Okay.
And it's really important that the book of Exodus is what it's going to cover. And
Okay.
It's found the book of Exodus is really, really foundational to the rest of the Bible.
All right.
And New Testament. So it's really important that you look at it. And the teacher, Mr. Ray Vander Land, he does a really, really good job on that.
Okay.
I've used him in a class that you were in before, Vincent, some time back. All right, I'm going to mute those of you who are online so I don't get any background noise. If you have a question or something and need me to stop, well, that won't work either because I'm not going to be seeing you. I guess I won't mute you. I'll do the best I can. If y'all have a question, just ask it and I'll hear you. All right. Who knows what the Sabbath day is? What is the Sabbath day? Not a trick question. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. What is the Sabbath day?
Day of worship.
Day of worship. Usually falls on what day of the week?
Friday.
What?
Friday.
It usually falls on Saturday. Sabbath day is
Oh, you're talking about our Sabbath? I mean,
the Sabbath day of the Bible. What is a Sabbath day? It usually falls in the Old Testament. It falls on the seventh day of the week, which is our Saturday.
Yeah.
So the Sabbath day. When did it begin? When did the observance? And we're looking at a context of introduction to the Old Testament. So I need you to think. In the context of the Old Testament, when did the observance of the Sabbath day begin? That is, well, let me ask further. Did Adam observe the Sabbath day? I'm not aware. Okay. Did Noah observe the Sabbath day? Did Abraham observe the Sabbath day? And the answer to that question, all three, is no, they did not. The Sabbath day is first mentioned. It's not really called the Sabbath day, but the seventh day of the week on which God rested in the creation week was mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis, but there's no indication that anyone ever observed the Sabbath day. It did not become law until when? Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath day is strictly a Jewish thing. It's not a Christian thing. There is no such thing as a Christian Sabbath. That is something that we have invented. People call the Christian Sabbath, but there's no such thing. The Sabbath day was strictly a Jewish event, and there's no record of it ever being observed before the time of the Ten Commandments. And there's reason for that. And one of the things that we'll talk about in our studies over the next few weeks is about that. It seems to be that the patriarchs, Adam up through Abraham, that they observed a 7-day work week. There was no seventh day of rest. And that's important, and I'll tell you why it's important, but I want you to see the fact first, and then I'll give you the meaning of it later on. When did Adam hear the voice of God walking in the garden. Remember that? When did he? What does the Bible say that as to when he did that? It says in the cool of the day. What's that? That's evening time. It seems to me from that statement and from other extracurricular information that you get from Jewish historians that the before the Sabbath, the time of communion with God was in the evening. You had your work day throughout the day. You had your responsibilities to do then, but in the evening, when there's nothing else you could do, it was time devoted to God. 10 Commandments. What are the 10 Commandments? Don't list them for me. Just tell me what they are.
Law of Moses.
Law of Moses. What do you know about the 10 Commandments? To whom were they given?
Moses.
They were given to Moses. And who was he to give them? Who were the commandments for?
Children of Israel.
The children of Israel, the Jewish people. Why were they written on 2 tablets of stone? Or 2 tables of stone?
Couldn't fill on one.
Couldn't fill one of them. It could be it. Actually, this is the 10 Commandments are essentially a contract, a covenant. And when you make a contract or make a covenant with someone, what do you normally do? You get a copy, he gets a copy. I don't think there's 4 on one side and 6 on the other, or 5 and 5 like you see at the courthouse. That's pretty neat the way they do that, but I don't think that's what happened. I think God made Moses a copy, or the children of Israel a copy, and he made himself a copy. A contract, a covenant, both have a copy of the covenant, so to speak. Did Adam have the 10 Commandments? No. Did Noah have the 10 Commandments? Did Abraham have the 10 Commandments?
No.
No, and there's a reason why that is, and that's some of the things that we'll be talking about as we continue in this course. Why exactly is there a people called Israel? Turn to any page in the Bible, just about, in the Old Testament anyway, and the focus is going to be on the Jewish people or the Hebrew people or the Semitic people. Why so much focus on the Semitic people?
Because that's who God had chosen for himself.
God had chosen them for what purpose? Why did God choose these people? These people are focused on in ancient times. These people are focused on even in modern times. We're going to be discussing that as we look. The purpose of this class is to help us understand why these people are who they are. We need to, the whole Old Testament surrounds them, or at least they're involved throughout the Old Testament. So we need to know who these people are and why they are. How many books, this is introductory class, how many books are there in the Old Testament? This is something you learned in Bible school. You should know this. How many?
39.
39. What if I told you there are not 39 books, there are 35? When you look in your English Bible and count down through the books, you'll find 39 books. But in the Hebrew Bible, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are all one book. But we divided them out because it's easier to divide it out like that. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's all one book. This is an introductory course. I don't know how long any of you have been involved in the Georgia School of Preaching. Some of you are just starting out. Some of you have been here for a while. Some of you have been preparing yourself to preach the word for years. Some of you are just new to that idea now. Some of you are just wanting to build upon a basic Bible knowledge that you already have. And some of you are in the early stages of building that Bible knowledge. This is an introductory course. That does not mean that we will remain at an elementary level, because we're not. This is not Sunday school. We're not going to talk about Joseph and his coat of many colors. We're not going to talk about Daniel and the lion's den. Well, we are going to talk about those things, but we're not going to tell these as the children's Bible stories that we've grown up. There are reasons, adult reasons, God reasons why these stories are in the Bible. We'll talk about the stories that you know from your childhood, but we'll get more involved in and see why they're actually here. We're not going to be able to do a verse-by-verse study. As you continue in the school, or if you've already done it, you'll read the book of Daniel and you'll go verse by verse. I taught the Daniel class here a few years ago, and we go verse by verse. I don't know how other teachers do it, but I go verse by verse. Same thing with the book of Isaiah. It's kind of hard to cover that verse by verse because there's so many of them. But you get in depth into the text. We're not going to do that in this class. That's not the purpose. This is an introductory class. The course is intended to give you a scope of the whole Bible and to show how each of these books fits into that scope. The Bible is God's story and how God brought Jesus Christ into the world to be the Savior of mankind, and to tell that story of Jesus, or God bringing Jesus Christ into the world to save mankind. We've got to find out, well, where did man come from and why did he need a Savior? That's part of our Old Testament study. That's part of the introduction to the Old Testament, to find out why that is the case, or where we came from and how do we get from that point to where we are in the New Testament. To some of you, some of this will be elementary. I hope it'll be a learning experience for all of us. As we go through our studies, we try to understand, again, this is a textual overview, not a textual study. So we're not going to get our shovels out and go deep. We are going to do more than just a flyby of the books. When I was coming up as a preacher and a student, I'll be honest with you, I hated these classes called introductions. And every time we study a book in the Bible, you have the introduction to it that tells you who wrote it, why they wrote it, when they wrote it. And to me, those were tedious and boring. Just tell me what the verses say. That's what I come to class for. Tell me what they say. Tell me what they mean. What does it matter if it was written in Rome or written in Jerusalem or written in Babylon? Does it matter if it's written to Rome or Jerusalem or Babylon? Well, it does matter. And that's some of the things that we'll see as we continue in this course, why those things are important. Not only the information, but why it's important. The more you study the Bible, the more you'll realize that these introductory points are necessary for full understanding of the text that you will study. We're not going to study the text, but when you get ready to study the text, this information, if you know it, it's going to help you understand it more fully. If you just know the text without the background, well, you can learn your church's dogma by doing that. You can learn Bible stories to tell children when you do that. You can quote a scripture or two to prove your point or prove your doctrine and not know all the background stuff. But if you want to have a fuller understanding of God's Word, then you need to get the background. Let me give you an example. Luke chapter 11, verse 9. It says, "So I say to you, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you." This verse is often used, particularly by televangelists, as a sort of name it and claim it type of Christianity. Treats this verse as an absolute. If you seek, you will find. If you knock, it will be opened unto you. It's an absolute. They treat it as that. Like the Proverbs are oftentimes treated as absolute. Are the Proverbs absolute? Don't know anything about the book of Proverbs? I don't think the school here gives you an in-depth study of the book of Proverbs. It gives you an in-depth study of the wisdom literature. You will do yourself a huge favor if you'll spend an hour a day reading the book of Proverbs for the rest of your life. If you read a chapter a day, you can read the book of Proverbs every month. And if you read it every month, you'll read it 12 times a year. It takes you about an hour. It won't take you an hour. It'll take you 15 or 20 minutes to just read a chapter a day. But I'm getting off track. The Proverbs are not absolutes. They're a rule of thumb. This is the way it normally works. And that's what this passage here is treated as an absolute sometimes. If you want a new Mercedes, what do you got to do? Well, just ask God for it. We'll give you a new Mercedes. That's the idea. You want the winning lottery ticket number, then just ask God for it, and you'll get it. If you're not getting the Mercedes, if you're not getting the winning lottery ticket number, then what?
You're not asking.
You're not asking in faith. You're not sending in enough seed faith money to get your answer. That's the idea behind the televangelist teaching. And while that will fill a lot of pews, apparently, because a lot of people listen to that, and it'll fill a lot of church coffers and preachers' pockets, it's not scriptural. Luke 11:9 has very little to do with fulfilling or guaranteeing personal fulfillment. You have to look at the context, the larger context of that passage in order to get its full meaning. The larger context of Luke 11, verse 9 is the whole book of Luke. I'm not going to go through the whole book of Luke, but it has an immediate context at the first of the chapter that begins. If you go back to it, don't just pull verse 9 out and say, that's what the Bible says. It's got to be true. Go back to the first of the chapter, get its context, and see what Jesus was trying to say. In that context, the disciples of Jesus had asked him to teach them to pray. And in response, Jesus teaches them what's called the Lord's Prayer. It's not the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is in John chapter 17. This is the Lord's example prayer for the disciples. But we won't get into that either. This is an example of how to pray. It's not a dogma to be memorized or quoted. A lot of folks won't start their services, their worship services, without quoting the Lord's Prayer. That's not a bad thing to do, but that's not the idea that Jesus was trying to give us when he gave this prayer. In this example of praying, which is a means of knocking, it's a means of seeking, it's a means of asking, do we see Jesus claiming a new donkey or a new cart? Do we see him asking for the best carpentry tools that are on the market at that time? Is he asking for a bucket full of gold? That's not the idea. I mean, if it's a name it and claim it verse, and Jesus should have taught them that, if you want something, just ask. If you want the Mercedes or the Cadillac Chariot, just ask God and he'll give it. It's not what it is. It's an illustration of how to be humble in asking God to help you live the life that he's called you to live. That's the purpose behind the prayer. God has asked us to live in such a way, and the prayer is asking God's blessings as we try to do that, asking God's provision as we try to live in order to serve him. If God thinks a Cadillac is what you need to serve him, then he'll find a way to get that to you. But that's not generally how God works. Jesus taught them to ask for forgiveness of sin. He taught them to ask about the coming of the kingdom. He taught them to ask about basic sustenance, daily bread. He didn't say, I want a bank account that'll carry me into retirement. He said, ask for your daily bread. That's what God is promising. That's what God guarantees. He doesn't guarantee our every whim or desire. And there's other examples that we could use. But I bring this one up just to point out that we need to know the background behind the verse if we're going to understand the verse. And as we look at these books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and so forth, we need to know their background if we're going to understand what they're trying to teach us. God is not just giving us historical information in these books. He's given us this information for a reason, for a purpose. He gives us a library of 66 books in our English Bibles anyway. What does the word Bible mean, by the way? Anybody know? Book or books. It comes from the Latin word biblia, which means books. It's a library of books. There are 39 in our English Bible in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. How much time is covered in the Old Testament period by the Old Testament material? not going to be an exact number there. We can get pretty exact in the New Testament, and in certain areas of the Old Testament, we can be pretty exact, but there are some dates that we don't know. So I'm going to give a roughly 4,000 year period that the Old Testament covers from Genesis chapter 1 through Malachi, the Old Testament time, about 4,000 years. Now, that's not exact. Some people go as much as 10,000 years. I don't believe it's that long. Those who don't believe in the Bible say there's billions and billions of years back there. But if you're a Bible student, a believer in God, you're not going to be able to carry it back that far. The question is, with all of these 4,000 years and all the things that are written from the different authors and the different types of literature that we have in the Old Testament, how does it all fit together? What does Psalms have to do with Genesis? What does Malachi have to do with Deuteronomy? These are contained in the same library, and they're not just random books. If you go into a public library, you'll find random books about everything in the public. These aren't random books. They all have something to do with one another. They all have bearing upon one another. To answer that question of what is their connection is the purpose of this course. You go into a Bible bookstore, a religious bookstore, you'll find a section on evangelism, or a section on grace maybe, or a section on Bible doctrines. There will be sections dealing with the millennium. There will be sections dealing with prophecy. There will be sections dealing with Bible characters. You name the topic, you'll find a section or a category for it in the Bible bookstore. God did not arrange the Bible like a Bible bookstore. This is not a topical book so that we can go and study themes from that book. He didn't arrange it in that way. It's read, he arranged it so that we could read it as a book, one book at a time. And we're going to not read, well, in your assignments, I'm asking you each week to read the book that we're preparing to study that week. So this week you should have read Genesis. If you had a syllabus, you didn't have a syllabus, so you couldn't do that. It won't take you long to read the book of Genesis. You probably read it before. But be familiar with the text when we come into class. Next week, the next 2 weeks actually, we'll be studying the book of Exodus. So just read the book of Exodus. You've got 2 weeks to read that. So, but read it so you can be familiar with the content, because we're not going to go verse by verse. We're going to find out why that book is there. The Bible is God's truth about himself. It teaches us how we should relate to him. In the context of the history that he's given us here, he teaches us how we should relate to him, how we can relate to him, but it's God's truth about himself. If you want a relationship with God, the means of obtaining that is through the book that he's given us. It tells us, and we'll see this, how the people, principally the people of Israel, came to experience God for themselves, and how they respond to his word or fail to respond to his word. So the Bible is not intended to be a theological textbook. It's full of life. It's full of vibrant stories. It's full of the vibrant stories of God and him redeeming his people. Our failure to grasp the overall message of the Bible is often due to not understanding or knowing the background of the book that we're reading. You just open a book and start reading, you're lost before you begin. Now you might come upon a story that, oh, I heard a preacher talk about that one time. The coat of many colors, that's in there somewhere, but what does it have to do with the rest of the book? It does, but what? And it's a nice story. Well, it's not so nice a story, I guess. I mean, Joseph wins in the end, but he went through a severe trial. But what's all that about? Is it just to give us a history of Joseph and the fact that he was a child and he was thrown into a pit and ended up in slavery, but he became what? king, but second in line to the king of the most powerful nation. And so it's a rags to riches story, right? No, that's not why that story is there. We can get that moral from it, I suppose, but that's not why the story is there. There's a background there. We need to understand that background in order to understand the story of Joseph. And that's just one story out of so many that we could talk about. There are things about the Bible not necessarily found in the Bible that are going to be helpful, if not absolutely necessary, to understanding the Bible more fully. And to be honest, I can't understand, or I can understand the Bible without going to see the Dead Sea. I don't have to go see it to understand what the Bible says. But if I were to go see the Dead Sea and see the surrounding area, that's going to help me a whole lot in understanding a whole lot of passages in the Bible. When I see David running from King Saul and being hunted down like a dog, and I think about the Dead Sea area where he was, that's going to help me understand some of the Psalms that he wrote. We don't have to take a trip to the Dead Sea to find that out, but it might be good to do some research to find out, well, what is this Dead Sea area? What is that place like? You know, I can properly divide 4 apples among 4 people with an elementary understanding of mathematics. But how much more will I be able to do if I move on to algebra and calculus and so forth? Really, I don't know the answer to that question because I was never a math genius, but I can do so much more with mathematics if I continue to do the research, continue to do the work, and do the study. Listen to a prayer of Paul in Colossians chapter 1. He's writing to the Christians at Colossae, and he says, for this reason, verse 9, Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, for this reason we also, since the day we heard it, we do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will. And I taught the book of Colossians the last quarter, and that's a pretty dominating statement there when he says to be filled with the knowledge of his will means to be controlled by it, be dominated by his will, to be controlled by his will. You have so filled yourself with it, there's room for nothing else. And so Paul is praying that you will be so filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and in all spiritual understanding that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work. If you are filled with, controlled by the knowledge of the will of God, you will be worthy of the Lord, or walk worthy of the Lord. You'll be fully pleasing him. You'll be fruitful in every good work, and you will increase in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to his glorious power for patience and long-suffering with joy. Well, to be filled with the knowledge of God's word is more than just reading through Genesis chapter 1. It's reading through and trying to understand Genesis chapter 1 and what it has to do with Revelation 22. It does have something to do with it. This is not an introductory course to the Old Testament and New Testament, but really the two should be combined because all of these books, all these writings from God, and they are from God, they have bearing upon one another. And we have to do the background research, or maybe we can call this the introductory research, to see what that is. One of the things that will help us in understanding the Bible is geography. I don't know if those of you online can see this map or not. We've got a map here. There's 2 maps that you need to be familiar with. In your study of the Old Testament, there will be 3 maps you need to be familiar with if you're studying Old and New Testament, but we're only in the Old Testament, so we'll stick with 2. One of those is the Promised Land. Now, everybody knows the Promised Land. Everybody knows that Jerusalem is there, and Bethlehem is there, and Mount Carmel is there. And there's also a map that you need to be familiar with that's the ancient Middle East. The Old Testament, the material in the Old Testament will deal with various countries and nations that are from the ancient Middle East that surround what's called the land of Canaan, or the land of promise. Have you ever heard of the term the Fertile Crescent? The Fertile Crescent. What is the Fertile Crescent? What is a crescent? It's basically a half moon or a sliver of a moon. The Fertile Crescent, this map doesn't really cover all of it, but it's what we have here. It's the area between the Tigris, or from the area of the Tigris and Euphrates, the plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, that goes up over the desert, the Syrian desert, all the way down really into Egypt. Now, across the Sinai Desert, it's somewhat kind of breaks up there, but this is called the Fertile Crescent, just simply because of its shape. Starting here in what we call Babylonia or Babylon, Nineveh, that area there, coming across the Saharan Desert, atop of the Saharan Desert, and going south through the land of Canaan, then on into Egypt. That's called the Fertile Crescent, and much of our, or all of our Bible stories, all the books of the Bible will deal, this is where it's taking place, somewhere in this area, in the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament, you go this direction. But in the Old Testament, this is the land that we're dealing with. Anytime you find a city or a name or a country or a town, it's going to be there somewhere. And again, this map should be down on into Egypt. Yeah, this is the end of that other map. This map ends here. This is that same area, and it comes on down into here into Egypt. So if you were to look at a map that showed you the difference between water and dry land and verdurous land, usually it's shaded in green, or there's green things growing. The water is colored blue, and deserts are probably like this, yellow or brown. If you had a map that showed the colors of where things grow, you would find a crescent. You don't grow here. This is a desert. This is the known world. This is not, it's inhabited, but not much. I mean, camels and people who have camels live in this area or across this area. But for the most part, when people wanted to go from Jerusalem to Babylon, how would they go? Well, the shortest route is straight through here. But who can survive that desert? Some have, but it's not the route of choice. You would go through the Fertile Crescent, where people live, where things grow. The area where the Tigris, the Tigris is a river, the Euphrates is a river. This is the Tigris River here. Euphrates is somewhere adjacent to it. Yeah, here it is. The Euphrates River here, the Tigris Euphrates here, Tigris River here. This area here is called Mesopotamia. What does Mesopotamia mean? Anybody know? It's two Greek words put together: meso, middle, potamia, river, middle of the river, between the rivers. Mesopotamia is between, it's got it right here, Mesopotamia is between the rivers, and speaking of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The world powers of Bible times come from that Fertile Crescent. Egypt down here in the south, over here in the the east, Babylon, Assyria, and Babylon, and Israel is sort of wedged between the two. Here's Israel, the area of Israel right here in the pink, not up here so much, but here by the Mediterranean Sea. This is considered Israel, and world power, Egypt down here, world power, Babylon here, world power, Assyria here, and here's Israel. Not only are these the world powers, but they're the world trade centers. If Babylon is going to trade its goods, whatever it is it produces, where does it need to take them? Down here to Egypt. The Egyptians are going to buy the Babylonian goods. The Babylonians are going to buy the Egyptian goods. How are they going to get there? Across that desert? No, they're going to go through Palestine. When you want to take your wares across the world, and that's what they did, that's how they traded back then, they would have caravans that would, remember Joseph, the guy with the coat of many colors, was sold into slavery. Who was he sold to? Midianite traders. There were people who were coming from this direction, actually probably up in here, but they were going to Egypt to either buy or sell. In this case, they were going to sell slaves, and Joseph was one of them. So the boys found them going that way. I think it's Judah found them going that way, and he sold his brother and went on down into Egypt. Well, this is the trade route. The Fertile Crescent is also the trade route for those times. That Syrian desert there, it was impassable. It happens, it can happen, but it's not something that people commonly did. When you come into Palestine or into the area of Palestine, there's some mountainous area over here, there's volcanic rock up in here, and it kind of pushes you to a narrow road that goes right down the coastline, right down this map that, well, maybe I can see it better on doesn't show it so much from the north. And they would come in from the east. They would come through here, through this mountain pass here, and they would come down and follow the coastal plain and go on down into to Egypt. And all the here is in the most of the Bible time. This is Israel, belongs to Israel. People are going through Israel to get to where they're going, and they're not just skipping through Israel, they're stopping there too and selling their wares. Here, can you see the river here? This is the Jordan River. You can't tell it from the map, but it looks, if you look at it from Google Earth or something like that, it looks like somebody took a shovel and just dug a ditch all the way down, and it goes on down into Africa. It's they call it the Great Rift Valley. And it's the deepest place on earth. In fact, right in here, I forget how far below sea level you can get, but you can fly a plane below sea level in this Jordan, what we call the Jordan Valley or the Rift Valley. It's just wasteland right there. The river goes through it, and you've heard of the Judean wilderness. That's where Jesus was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. It's just right outside of Jerusalem. It's not very far from Jerusalem. You could walk there in probably half an hour, maybe not half an hour, but you can walk there in just a little bit of time. Of course, we have over here the Mediterranean Sea. This is more used as far as travel and so forth, as far as the Bible is concerned, in the New Testament, but it's always here in the Old Testament. When they speak of the sea, and it doesn't always call it the Mediterranean Sea, but when they speak of the sea, it's referring to the Mediterranean Sea. What I want you to see, speaking of sea, is that Israel is at the crossroads of the world. Even in New Testament times, where this becomes the populace, if they want to sail to Egypt, they can cross the sea, and their ships can do that. But a lot of times the travelers would caravan down through Israel. But that's how armies would travel back and forth. When the Babylonians were fighting the Egyptians, and they sometimes were fighting the Egyptians, guess where they got to go? They got to go through Israel. So Israel is a stomping ground. Israel is a marketplace. Israel is at the crossroads of the world. God was planting his people at a place where they would be visible and in contact with the whole world. You think that's by accident? You think God just said, let me see, I'll put them here. God planned where he would put those people. I think it was a spiritual choice. There's a spiritual significance there. They were to be the Israelites were the representatives of God on earth. They were to give the world a taste of what God's kingdom is supposed to be like. And the whole world could witness it because the whole world was going through Israel at some time or another. Anybody of any significance, common people weren't making those kind of trips, but travelers, politicians, soldiers, they came through here and they would know what Israel was like. And if Israel was doing their job, fulfilling their responsibilities, the world could have known the God of Israel. Of course, Israel did not do that. But the world could come to understand that blessing comes to those who submit or live under God's rule. But they would also come to understand that if you don't, then curses come to those who do not submit to God's rule. So they, going back to the Israel. What are some names that are given to the land of Israel? Different names that you find in the Bible. When you see that map, what do you think of? Actually, it's got one here, map of Palestine. Where'd that name come from? Palestine. Does it sound like anything you're familiar with? You ever heard of the Philistines? Philistine? I think it was a term of needling. They called it the land of Palestine because it would stick the Jews in the eye, so to speak. Because the Philistines were their arch enemies, at least in a portion of their history. It's called Israel. It's called Canaan's land. It's called land of promise. It's called the land of milk and honey. Northern part here is called Galilee, or the Galilee of the nations. It's probably the most multicultural area, even today. I went to Israel one time. I stayed on the Sea of Galilee, and it's a whole different animal than Jerusalem. The two places aren't even comparable, just a few miles away, but the land here is more Gentilish, if I can say that. Even in Jesus' day, he crossed the sea, and there were you ever heard of the Decapolis? In the Bible, in the New Testament, Decapolis means the 10 cities. There were 10 Gentile cities over there. This is Jewish territory. There should not have been a Decapolis there, or at least not 10 Gentile cities. But it was. And one of the reasons is it was so associated with the northern cities or countries that would come through. This is the first place they came to. This is where they would sell their wares to the Jews. And it became very, very un-Jewish, if I can say that in a lot of ways. Jerusalem, if you look at it on the map here, it's up on a mountain range. If you were a traveling salesman and you're traveling through Israel and you got the choice of the flatlands down here by the coast to sell your wares or a trek up through the mountains, which way you want to go? Which is easier? We're going to stay in the flatlands by the coast. This is where most of the people are going to be because everybody likes the beach. They didn't like the beach probably so much like we do today. But this is where the sailors are. This is where you can sell to the ships, and they can take it across the world and sell whatever. So this is where you're going to sell. To go to Jerusalem would be really hard, and most of them didn't. And so Jerusalem, in this little hideaway, it's the capital of the area, but it kind of remained strictly Jewish because the Gentiles just didn't care to go. Who wants to climb the mountain and do that when it's so much easier to, if I'm going from one place to the other, I don't want to go through the mountains. Take the easy flatlands. If I'm going there to sell, I'll sell it to these guys that live here and let them go to the mountains. But I'm going to take the easy route. And so Jerusalem kind of got, just by the nature of where it was, left alone. It stayed mainly Jewish, not completely, but mainly Jewish, kind of isolated. one guy said, like a candle in a saucer. And it should have, because of that candle in a saucer type of locality, it should have had a great influence for God. How big is the land of Canaan? When you look at that map, it's pretty big. How big is it? Say, for comparison, it's 2,400 square miles compared to Georgia, 60,000 square miles. We're 60,000 in the state of Georgia. You probably travel across the state of Georgia in a day. You drive from Chattanooga down to Tallahassee. How long does it take to get there? You're just straight driving through, not stopping.
5 hours.
5 hours maybe? We're 60,000 square miles. They were 2,400. Well, they were, I guess, 2,400. About the size of the state of Delaware. I've not been to Delaware, but I looked on the map and tried to figure out proportionately what it was, about the size of Delaware, which is not very big. And if you think about that, a place 2,400 square miles, and yet all of history as we know it is dominated by this place. You know, I don't care what history you read, whether you're reading Roman history or Egyptian history or Babylonian history, Israel is in there. It had, you know, maybe didn't always have in every era a lot to say about it, but Israel's always there because you got to go through Israel to get anywhere back in the day. They didn't fly back then, so they didn't have, you know, we couldn't skip the country. They had to go through Israel. And they say that the climate of Palestine is such that no matter where you're from, you can find someplace like home in Israel. You got the desert over here, you got the beach over here, you got the mountains up here, you got the flatlands in the middle, you got the River Jordan, you got the Sea of Galilee. Any place that you can find or that you might be from here in America, you can find a place like that in Israel. You can be at Mount Hermon snow skiing in the morning, and maybe 30 or 40 minutes later be at the Sea of Galilee water skiing in the same day. I mean, in the same hour almost. You can then go over to the Mediterranean shores. And you ever heard of a Joppa orange? Come on, you should know those Joppa oranges back in your day. Back in the day, my parents and grandparents, the Joppa orange was considered the orange. Now we have navel oranges and California oranges. Back then, the Joppa orange was the thing to have. But anyway, you could go to the Mediterranean Sea and get you a Joppa orange, turn back in toward Jericho. Where's Jericho? Lost Jericho. Here he is. And get you some dates and figs. It's pretty dry in this area right here. Then you could go. You can't go for a swim in the Dead Sea. You ever been to the Dead Sea? Anybody ever been to the Dead Sea? I heard tell that you can't drown in the Dead Sea. And I had to put it to the test. You really can't drown in the Dead Sea. You're going to float. You can't. You could drown if you get turned upside down because but you're going to float. You don't have to swim. You just sit out there and read the newspaper, and just float in the water. But anyway, you can travel the whole country in a day's time. It's a wonderful geography, but you need to become familiar when you study the Old Testament. And when somebody says, well, he went up to Jerusalem, what does that mean? He went up to. There's a reason why it says up, even by elevation, because you got to go up. Even if you live in the north, you go up to Jerusalem because it's a higher elevation. And when in the story, I keep mentioning the coat of many colors, when you talk about Dothan, I just saw the name Dothan there. The Dothan's involved in that story. If you don't know where that is, maybe it's not a big deal to you, but it helps to understand the story sometimes if you know where what is. Here in this Rift Valley, it's not so much anymore, not anymore. This was where the lions and bears, we read about Elijah who killed the bears, or the bears killed the boys. Elijah caused the bears to kill the boys. Lions and bears in that area. Well, I need to move on because I'm supposed to cover Genesis tonight. I've got an hour left to do that. 4,000 years of history before the time of Christ. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 covers most of that period. The creation of the universe, the fall of man, the Garden of Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, are all in that first couple of thousand years, what's called the prehistoric part of the humankind in general. Before we get to the part that starts talking about Jews, we have a story of the world without the Jews. There was a time when the world was without the Hebrew nation. There were no Hebrews. But then we can, by Genesis chapter 12, we find Abraham. He's not a Jew, or at least not when we find him, but it's from him that the Jews come in. The Old Testament, from then on, can be divided into about, four parts of about 500 years each. That's what I have here on the board. The division of time, there you got about 2000 BC, which is at the time of Abraham, when Abraham was chosen. 1500 BC is about the time of the Exodus, BC being before Christ. Well, the Jews don't use before Christ. They say before current era, BCE. And that's become the typical scientific definition anymore. Nobody says, scholars don't use BC anymore because it's favoring the religion of Christianity. So it's called BCE. I'm not going to use that. But if you want to be scholarly, BCE. 2,000 years before Christ, 1,500 years before Christ is the Exodus, 1,000 years before Christ is the beginning of the empire, 500 BC is the time of the exile. Those are rough numbers. In the time of 2000 BC, it was Abraham who was chosen, from whom the Israelites would come, and this period was ruled by patriarch. What's a patriarch? You got matriarchal societies and patriarchal society. What's a patriarchal society?
Spiritual fathers.
It's led by the fathers. It's led by the men. In this case, the fathers were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not just them, Adam, Noah, all those men that are listed in those genealogies in the first part of Genesis are the patriarchs. In the time of the Exodus, Moses is the leader, and they are led mostly through prophecy or through prophets. Judges will find them also. During the empire, they're of course led by kings, David being the most prominent figure. 500 BC, the time of the exile, Isaiah is the most prominent figure, and they were ruled by priests. The priestly rule was good, but not good enough. The kingly rule was not from God, but God allowed it, wasn't good enough. The prophetic rule was good, but not good enough. The patriarchal rule was good, but not good enough. We need someone who combines all of them, prophet, priest, and king, and as well as our Father, and we find that in Jesus Christ. Because I have to get into the book of Genesis, I'm going to skip through some of my notes. The book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is that prehistoric period that we spoke of. Genesis 12 through 50 covers the beginning of the Hebrew nation, and the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with Genesis, were written by Moses. Then comes the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth that continue the history of that period. I have for you, I told you that the books of the Bible in the Hebrew are a little bit different than ours. They're arranged differently than ours. So I gave you a copy of the Jewish arrangement of the books, and there's a reason for that arrangement. They didn't just do that to be different from the English. In fact, the English was done after the Jewish Bible came first, and there's a reason for that order of the books. It's not a chronological order. Some of it is chronological, but not all. We try to, in our English Bibles, make it chronological. You start out with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's correct. Then we go Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And then we go to 1 and 2 Chronicles, which is a repetition of the Kings. Then we do Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then comes the prophetic writings. They are not part of the chronology. When you get to Nehemiah in our Bibles, you're basically at the end of the Bible, the end of the time frame of the Bible. So Genesis through Nehemiah in the English Bible, you have the whole history of the Bible. Then we have the writings, the poetic writings, and then we have the prophets. And we divide them into major and minor prophets. And the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, they're considered chronological in that way. And then the minor prophets, they're considered chronological as well, but they're actually, they don't come after the major prophets only in the order that we have them in the Bible. They are actually coming during the time of the major prophets. Why is major prophets and minor prophets? Why that division? Anybody know? What's a major prophet? What's the difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet?
Length of writings.
The number of pages. That's all. That's the only difference. The major prophets are no more holy than the minor prophets. It's just the message that God gave them was shorter or longer, as the case may be. So in that historical section, we'll see the rise and the fall of a nation. The Jewish nation starts out as slaves. They're in Egypt. They come out of Egypt, stay in the wilderness for 40 years, go into Canaan, have judges for a while, but eventually they ask for a king. God gave them a king, and Saul begins, David, then Solomon. And Solomon is at the peak of the time, peak of the nation. David really is. And then Solomon just sort of builds upon what David had established for him. David established the peace through war. Solomon lived in that peace. And then from Solomon onward, it's a constant decline with a few upswings, but not very many. But it's a constant decline until we come to the exile. The Assyrians took over the northern tribes. When I say northern tribes, there was a division. There was a civil war after Solomon, and the nation divided into two. You had the north and the south. 10 tribes to the north, 2 tribes to the south. And the northern tribes were called Israel. The southern tribes were called Judah. Israel went into captivity in 721 under the Assyrians, which I'll see there on that. Here is Assyria here, Babylon here. Israel was taken over by the Assyrians, and Babylon took over the tribes called Judah. But the Israelites failed to understand why God had chosen them. They considered themselves the chosen nation, but they can continually, consistently fail to understand what their purpose was in being chosen. They failed to understand the message that the prophets were giving them about the Messiah. God was telling them that I'm going to bring Messiah. I'm going to bring Messiah. I'm going to bring a kingdom. And they only thought of, and it's still true in Jesus' day and still true today among the Jews, they only think of the Messiah in a Jewish sense. From the very beginning, when God said, I'm going to bring to Abraham, I'm going to bring someone from your seed. He's going to be a savior, or he's going to be for all nations, a blessing to all nations. But the Jews never accepted that. Even Paul arguing to that point in most of his books. Most of the false teachings about the kingdom of God today are based in the Jewish misconceptions of their own prophets. Even among Christian denominations today that are looking forward to a 1,000-year reign of Jesus in Jerusalem, it's based in the misconceptions of the Jewish beliefs about their own prophets. If you're waiting for a 1,000-year reign of Jesus in Jerusalem, your beliefs are more Jewish than Christian, and it's not from the Bible. And we're not going to talk about that a whole lot because that's a New Testament teaching as far as the 1,000-year reign. But if you're looking for that literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus in Jerusalem, you've missed what the prophets have said in the Old and New Testaments about Messiah. I was going to spend some time on the order of the books. Maybe I can do that at a later time, but I have run out of time for that. I need to get into the book of Genesis if I'm going to cover that. But there is a great difference between the Jewish order of the books and the English order of the books. And I'm going to try, I'm not going to do it absolutely, but as we go through the books, I'm going to stay more closely to the Jewish order than the English Bible order, because the English Bible order did not, I think the Jewish order was what God intended. In fact, when Jesus used the Hebrew, or used the Bible, he used the Jewish order of the books. He spoke of, we have, I think, 5 divisions in our English Bibles of the Old Testament, and the Jews have 3. They have law, prophets, and the writings. And you'll be surprised at some of the books that are considered prophets and some of the books that are considered writings. Daniel's not considered to be one of the prophets by the Jews. He's considered history, prophetic history, but history, because of what his book talks about. Ruth in our Bibles is considered part of history, but the Jews treat it as prophecy. The book of Chronicles is in our Bible considered history, but I think the Jews consider it as prophetic. And we'll talk about that as we get to that. Let's take a break for a few minutes. Need the restroom. We can't use the ones on this floor. We have to go upstairs. I think y'all know where that is, so I won't go into that. For those of you who are online, we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and try to approach the book of Genesis. For those of you online, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording just so we don't. I think I'm going to pause the recording if I can find out how to do it. Recording. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. What is Genesis about? Genesis about? Let me narrow it down for you. What is Genesis chapter 1 about?
The beginning,
The beginning? Creation. What if I told you Genesis 1 is not about how God created the world in 6 days? What do you think? It says it is. That's not what it's about. It's got it in there.
I think it really is talking about, as it says, the very first verse, in the beginning, God.
Beginning God. This is God's story. That's right. And it's God's story about God. And he wants who to understand that? That's one of the questions that we have to answer when we start talking about the book of Genesis. What do you think it means when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. What if I told you in Genesis chapter 1, the story is not so much about creation, it is about creation, but the story is about God's power over chaos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form. The earth was void. The earth was, or the face of the deep was covered with darkness. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, it says. Usually when we come to these verses of Genesis chapter 1, we want to talk about how God is the creator, and he is the creator. We want to talk about the 6 days of creation, and they are in this text. We want to talk about how we did not evolve from apes, and it's true, we did not. But we don't, and we put a lot of stock in the words that God said, and it was good, or it was very good. This is the go-to chapter of all Christian, well, not all, but many or much Christian apologetics. Books and books and books have been written about Genesis chapter 1 to defend the Christian belief that things were created, did not evolve. You ever been to the Genesis Center? It's a museum. I forget who built it, but it's up in just south of Cincinnati. I'm not sure if it's in Kentucky or Ohio.
Yeah, I've been to creation, yeah.
The Creation Museum,
Yeah.
That's what it's called. And they also have the Ark up there now. Both of them are just wonderful. There's some things about the Creation Museum that I don't think are right, but for the most part, it's just a great place to go to see, find evidences or see the shown evidences of creation. That's what we use Genesis chapter 1 for. We go to Genesis chapter 1 to prove we were created. We did not evolve. That's not why Genesis chapter 1 is in the Bible. We don't talk about it verse 2 a lot. We talk about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth because that's the first verse in the Bible. We memorize it. We don't talk about verse 2 a lot. We talk about the rest of the verses where God created or said, let there be this, and then it was. Let there be this, and then it was. And we get excited about that, about God showing creation. But when it says the earth is declared to be without form and void, and that the deep waters were described as darkness, a term in the Bible that's typically used to describe evil or the results of evil. The Hebrew word for darkness, according to Thayer's lexicon, means darkness, literally. Figuratively, it means misery, destruction, death, ignorance, sorrow, wickedness, obscurity. This word darkness, or translated darkness, can be translated in those ways and is translated in those ways in other places. And you'll find it often used in the Old Testament, and while it's translated darkness, it has a reference to something evil or something sinister. That's the word that's used to describe what covered the face of the deep in the beginning. Yes, sir.
But without mankind, would that have had any meaning?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, it goes to the point I'm going to, if you'll hang on to that question, that's a great question. And I think it goes to the point of what I want to say here as a reason that it's here. Before we go there, let me go to the fact that it says without form. What does it mean without form? Well, again, I'll go to Thayer's. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I have to quote from him. It says it means to lie waste. This is what God created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It was without form, it was void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Without form means to lie waste. a desolation, desert, figuratively a worthless thing, adverbially in vain, confusion, empty, without form, nothing, naught, vain, vanity, waste, wilderness. These are the words that are usually translated by this from this word without form. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10, it says, he found him in a desert land. This is God, a reference to God finding Israel. He found him in a desert land, and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. Wasteland is the word that's described, or that's also translated without form in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 21, it says, do not turn aside, for then you would go after empty things which cannot profit or deliver, for they are nothing. The word nothing is the same word that's translated without form in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. In Job chapter 6, verse 18, it translates the word as nothingness. Isaiah 24, verse 10 translates the word as confusion. God created confusion, nothingness, nothing, wasteland, without form. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We think that, no, it's like it looks today, but it's not. It's without form. It's darkness covering the face of the deep. And then that word void, it speaks of according to Thayer, an undistinguishable ruin, an emptiness, void. Isaiah and Jeremiah both use this word to describe the condition of Jerusalem in the Holy Land after Babylon got done with it. It was void, totally destroyed. And yet these are the words that are used by God to describe what God created in the beginning, without form, void, darkness. Why did he do that? Why did God record that? Going to your, I think, to your question. Why did he not make it easier for us and just say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, let there be light, and there was. Let there be animals on the face of the earth, and then there was. We get that part. That's easy for us. Why not just leave it easy? What's with this verse 2, without form, void, and darkness? I think the answer in the question, or to the question, is going to come when we understand to whom the book of Genesis was written. Who was Genesis written to? Any guesses? Any ideas? Was it written to David? Was it written to Abraham? Was it written to John the Baptist? Who was the audience, the first audience to whom this book was written? We never think about it, and we miss part of Genesis, the understanding of it, because we never think about it, to whom it was written. It was written to the Egyptian slaves, or the Israelite slaves who had just come out of Egypt and were at the foot of Mount Sinai, or were there in the desert. They had been in bondage for 400 years, well, at least they had been away from Israel, from the land of Canaan for 400 years. They were not slaves the whole time they were in Egypt. And they were going to spend the next 40 years being trained by God how to go into the promised land, or how they are to be when they get into the promised land. But when they came out of Egypt, what were they? What kind of people were they? Nothing. Put yourself in their shoes. Where have you been for the last 2 or 3 generations? You've been in Egypt. When you went there, when your fathers or grandfathers, whoever went there, they came as invited guests. Joseph invited his family at the behest of Pharaoh to come and live in the greatest part of the land. We'll talk about that next week, so I'm not going to deal with it today. But they were invited to come to live there in the land of Egypt. But dynasties changed, time went on, and a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph came into power, and he made these people slaves. What kind of people are slaves? What do people do to people who are slaves? What kind of mentality do people who are slaves have? That's the way these people were. Their self-esteem had been destroyed. Their value, self-value had been destroyed. their self-worth had been destroyed. Maybe some of them knew who Abraham was, their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Maybe some of them knew the God of Abraham, their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's God, but most of them had gone through a period of affluence in Egypt wherein they basically forgot God, and then they turned into slaves in that same country, and that because their fathers or grandfathers had forgotten God, they don't know who God is. They don't know who to turn to. One of the things that really strikes me, it's in the book of Exodus, not the book of Genesis, was that the Bible says they cried out and God heard their cry, but they didn't cry out to God. They just cried out. They didn't know a God to cry out to. When they come into the wilderness, led there by God, after God split the Red Sea and brought them into the wilderness, He gave them water, He gave them food. What do they need to hear from God? God gives them Genesis. What they needed to hear is what He gave them. He says, He begins it by saying, I am the God who can create everything you see from chaos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and He made it chaos, but then He, from that chaos, brought light, life, and everything that we see and hear. Why do they need to know that? You've been living in a life of chaos for the last 400 years. I can make something of you. If I can boil down the book of Genesis to a statement, that's it. God is not trying to show us how I created light or how, giving us a scientific textbook of how creation took place. It is scientific. There's nothing in it that will violate any true law of science. But that's not why it's given. It's given to these children of Israel, these children of Abraham, who are living or who have been basically dragged out into this desert. They didn't know where they were going. They had it bad in Egypt being slaves. They were being killed, being tortured. A rigorous existence we'll find in the book of Exodus. But Moses is taking them from a place where at least you can grow things. At least I have an oven in which I can bake my bread. And he's taking them across through the Red Sea into a desert. I've been to that desert. There's nothing but hot rocks and sand. There's just nothing there. If somebody told me you're going to have to live there for 40 years, I don't know what I would do. I don't know how you can live there for 40 days. It's just a horrible existence to have to live. What's God teaching them? Trust me. Trust me. And he trains them throughout that 40-year period to trust him. At first, they did not. The first generation didn't trust him very well. They said they did, but then they went back to that they just forgot who God was. It was their children who actually went into the land of Canaan. God is recording this for those people. And to understand fully what Genesis is getting at, not just Genesis chapter 1, but the book of Genesis, we need to understand to whom it was written. If you can keep in your mind, when you read the book of Genesis, this wasn't written for us to have a Bible study in 21st century America. This was written for those Jews. Can we benefit from it today? Yes. Can we learn history lessons from it today? Yes. But it was written to tell these people who were going through a chaotic period, had been through a chaotic period, that I'm the God of chaos. Or no, I'm sorry. I'm the God who can bring life from the chaos. The connection between the creation of the world, the creation of life, and the God who spoke to Abraham is what we're trying to find in the book of Genesis. Who is this God? Why should I follow him? Why is he different than the gods of Egypt. They knew about gods. And God had just demonstrated for them when they're reading this book. Really, Genesis is the first book in the Bible, but the book of Exodus is the setting of the writing of the book of Genesis. Does that make sense? Adam didn't have the book of Genesis. Abraham didn't have the book of Genesis. Nobody had the book of Genesis until the people of the Exodus. So they're living the Exodus, but he's telling them about the Genesis. So really, Genesis is the second book, you might say, in the Bible. It's not. It's the first book in the Bible. But these people to whom he's writing, they're living in this wilderness existence, and they need to know, who is this God that brought them out here? The Ten Commandments, or the giving of the Ten Commandments, the event at Mount Sinai, was basically, you might say, a wedding ceremony between God and these people. Isaiah refers to it as such in the book of Isaiah. How should they know that God says, I want to be your God and you be my people? And they said, we want you to be our God and we'll be your people. Why would they make that agreement? They had to come to know who their bridegroom is. That's what the book of Genesis is about. It's teaching them who God is. Who is this God that freed them from slavery? So starting with Genesis chapter 1, God seeks to give this people a sense of identity, a sense that connects them with the God who just performed these 10 plagues, who just divided the Red Sea, and who was providing them food, water, and shelter. He's trying to give them a sense of self-worth. Slavery, it's a horrible thing. Just think about the concept of a person owning another person. It's just an evil thing. But when that one person or one group of people claims to own this other group of people, it destroys the identity, or the sense of identity of that people, of those slaves. They become disconnected from everything. Whether it's captive slaves or indentured slaves or people born into slavery, they see themselves as nothing because that's what they're told throughout their lives. You're nothing. You're property. You have no value, or the only value you have is what I can sell you for. That's the mentality that they grow up with. From the time that they're babies, they're taught you are nothing any more than that cow or any more than some other beast of burden. That's what you are. And they see themselves as different from their owners. And we're not like our owners. They're something. We're nothing. And God is trying to, through the book of Genesis, say, you are something. That was the reason for him telling them about the call of Abraham. I chose you. I created you from nothing. I took a 100-year-old man with a 90-year-old wife, men who, the Hebrew writer in the book of Hebrews says, were a couple who were just as good as dead as far as their ability to produce children. I took a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman, and I caused them to have a baby, and from that baby I have you. From nothing, I created you. I can do that because I'm God. I wanted to do that because I chose you. He's trying to build up self-value, self-esteem. You are worth something. They treated you as nothing, but you are worth. Not only do you have value, you are connected to the very God who has the power to split the Red Sea. You are connected to the very God who not only creates life, but sustains life. These stories in the book of Genesis are to help them see where they came from, that God has a purpose for them. He's trying to build up their self-worth and help them to see the task that God has for them. So it's not a book about apologetics. It's not a book just about Jewish history. This is a book about God redeeming these people, or helping these people understand who they are. These people understood evil probably better than we ever will. They lived in a pagan culture that was, they summoned the spirits of evil. They were treated evilly by the evil people. When we talk about evil, we talk about wickedness, but we've never experienced it like they experienced it. It was the master of their lives. They lived under its regime, under its power. It was mercilessly destroying their lives. And this book answers the question of where did evil come from and how it exerts its influence on God's creation, how God can even have control over it. The book of Genesis will address the question from whence Israel came. I don't know if I can help you understand how they would have heard this book. I mean, it starts out talking about Genesis, or about the creation, and about the flood, and then about Abraham. God is bringing them along in their education to the point of Abraham. But when they get to Abraham, oh, I know him. You knew him? I mean, this is the God, remember, who just split the Red Sea. This is the God who just gave them water from a rock in a desert. This is the God who just destroyed all the pagan gods and powers of Egypt before their very eyes. This is not something they heard about. They witnessed it. And when they get out here in the desert, God tells them, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of your forefathers. Here's a people who think of themselves as nothing, but now they say, we are connected to the God who did this. That's why the book of Genesis was written. It's not written so much as a creation book or a history book. It's written to help these slaves, these Jewish slaves, understand who is God and who are they in the purpose of God. He is the origin of the world. He is the origin of life. He is the origin of Israel. You and I, it's a book about Bible stories, about a foreign people in a foreign land. And as you read through it, you'll become familiar again with stories that you have heard from your childhood. But to them, it was an awakening. Oh, you're that God. And you chose us. Of all the nations of the world that you could have chose, you chose us. How much they understood about their the long range purpose of God, I don't know. At this early stage in the Bible, I don't know how much they knew. God says, you are a peculiar people. You are a holy nation. I have chosen you. But how much they understood about what that meant about the future, I don't know. If you look in the book of 1 Peter, Peter says that the prophets, including Moses, I think, have inquired and searched carefully, who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, speaking to the Christians in Bithynia, in the places that Peter was writing to. Those prophets of old, they have searched and carefully and inquired carefully, who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ who was in them was indicating when he testified beforehand of the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. Moses spoke of the coming Christ, but he didn't really understand fully what he was talking about. Same thing with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and so forth. But if you go back and you see what Moses was saying, we on this side can say, oh, he was talking about Jesus. He was talking about the coming of Christ. But back then, Moses was wondering, how does this work? From Genesis, we learn that the God who began the world, the God who created Israel, from a man who is as good as dead, the God who brought Jesus, it's the same God who brought Jesus into the world, because he loved the world, and he created Israel for that purpose. And now he creates a new nation. Does the Bible use the term a new creation? What's that talking about? We are new creatures. We are reborn. The Bible speaks of a new heaven, a new earth, a new life, eternal life. That's what we can get from Genesis. We get the same thing from Genesis that the Israelites did at the foot of Mount Sinai. Oh, you're that God who's making a new creation. And we're part of it. You have chosen us to be a part of what that is. Just like Israel had the opportunity to begin again, so we have the opportunity to begin again. So we have an application that we can make of Genesis just as they did, if we'll make the proper application of its teachings. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit was hovering over the face of the waters. What does that mean? The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The word hovering, Hebrew word, means to brood. What does that mean? That doesn't help us a whole lot if you don't know anything about brooding. What does it mean to brood? A bunch of chicks is referred to as a hen's brood. What does it mean to brood? Well, protect, give life to, hover over. You might say the word is used in two places besides here in Genesis chapter 1 in the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, it says, as an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, it's the same word, brood, spreading out its wings, taking them up, carrying them on his wings. Jeremiah 23, verse 9 uses the word, my heart within me is broken because of the prophets. All my bones shake. I'm like a drunken man, like a man whom wine has overcome because of the Lord and because of his holy words. That word shake is the same word the Hebrews translated, or the English translates brood, there in Genesis chapter 1. I don't know about you, that doesn't help me a whole lot. What does it mean? How does shake and brood have any connection one with another? If my understanding is correct, God originally created a chaotic, formless mess. And from that mess, he brought life. The Spirit brooding over the darkness, over the formless mass, hovering over it, he gives it life. Later in chapter 2, we were told that the Spirit breathed life into the clay form of Adam. I want to think, although they didn't use that word, the Hebrew writer, Genesis didn't use it, God didn't use that word in Genesis chapter 2. I want to think it's the same idea. He's giving life, breathing life into that formless mass, in that chaotic mass, just as he breathed life into Adam. Somebody said one time that the mighty wind sound on the day of Pentecost was the Spirit of God breathing life into the church. I don't know if that's true, but it makes good sermon. God, through creation, created chaos, and then he brought order out of that chaos. And he did that to show us that no matter how chaotic your lives can be or can become, I can make order out of it. I can bring life from it. I think that's the message of Genesis. And it's a message that they could have benefited from there in that desert. They were nothing. They felt themselves as nothing. They were taught and trained to believe that they were nothing. And God says, I can breathe life into you and use you to bring in my new creation. He took the utter confusion, produced life. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him, nothing that was made was made. And in him was what? Life. And that life was the light of men. I think that's a summation of the book of Genesis. What they were to hear. Well, there's a lot of stories. There's 50 chapters. But it begins with, I am the God who can create life from chaos. Your life has been chaotic. I am the God who can bring life from chaos, make order out of chaos. And I think that's the message that he wanted to give to them. God wants us to see that he can change that chaos into order. The gods of Egypt could not do that. He wanted them to see that. He showed them in the 10 plagues. These gods have no power. These are not real gods. And we'll see that more next week. But he wanted them to see this is not, or these are not the gods who can bring. They bring the chaos. They can't bring life. Only I can do that. I am the I am. So, having said that, and I've got 5 minutes to cover this, did God create the chaos?
That's my question. I find it difficult in my mind, my pea-sized brain, I find it difficult to understand.
It's a fair question. It's a fair question. Did God create the chaos? If God and chaos are opposite of each other, and they are, how can God have created chaos? And to answer that, I want to turn to a New Testament passage to help us understand why this is. Turn with me to John chapter 9. John chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? They were living under the conception that if you're blind, you must have done something really, really bad. And Jesus answered what?
Not this man nor his parents.
Neither this man nor his parents, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. What does that say? That says God made him blind. This man was born blind. Why? So that the works of God can be revealed in him. God created chaos so that the works of God could be seen through that chaos. By him, the works of God can be revealed in this man by Jesus taking away the blindness, healing the blindness, giving sight to the blind. I am God, and I can give sight to this blind. And I wanted you to see this. God wanted you to see this. He made this man born blind. He lived 30 years blind just so you this day could see the power of God. 2,000 years before these people were in the wilderness, God created chaos so that 2,000 years later, he could have this moment with them and say, I am the God who can bring order out of chaos. Now, if there was no chaos for him to make this illustration with, then he would have no point to prove, I suppose.
Now, did he make this man blind or did he allow it?
Well, it says, he says, Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. And the question is, why is the guy blind? And Jesus says, it's not because he sinned, is not because his parents sinned, but because the works of God can be revealed in this event. I think God made him blind for a reason. I don't think God makes every man blind. I think some blindness is due to heredity, some blindness is due because people poke their eyes out. But this man was made blind, it seems to me, this is my understanding of it, in order that on this day, in that crowd, the glory of God could be seen in his healing. And I make the same application to God created the formless, void, darkness to prove that from it he can create life. In order that these Israelites who felt like themselves as formless, void, emptiness, nothing, I can give you life. I am the God, the only God. I am the I am. I'm the only one who can do this. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not. But when we look at Genesis chapter 1 or the book of Genesis, we need to come away with the picture that God rules. God is sovereign over everything. And those people at the foot of Mount Sinai needed to see that. And that's to whom the book was written. We get much out of the book of Genesis. It's in our Bibles for a reason, but they were the original audience, and the reason God wrote it was, I want you to see I am the sovereign God. And from this chaotic life that you had in Egypt, I can bring life. Okay, that's not a summation of all the stories of the book of Genesis, or at least we didn't cover all the stories of the book of Genesis. But I think when we look at Genesis, we see God working to establish this relationship with these people at the foot of Mount Sinai. If you see that, you'll understand why those stories are there. I'm probably not going to go back and cover those stories. When you get to the book of Genesis in your textual studies, you'll cover those stories more in depth. But I think if you'll just see it as this is God's story being told to those people to bring them to life, the beginning of this nation, I think it'll help you in understanding the book of Genesis. Any questions, disagreements?
Gives me a whole new perspective on Genesis. It really does. As far as the way I look at Genesis, I'm still not so certain about the chaos.
I understand.
But I do understand, better who it's written to.
That's good. That's the main thing I want you to get is that this was written to those people to help them understand something.
Yeah, makes sense.
It wasn't just telling them stories about a guy with a multicolored coat.
That's right.
It was to help them understand something. What were they to understand? And we'll talk more about that next week.
Good.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Folks who are online.
Thank you.
I will, when I get home, I will copy this and put it on YouTube and then send you a link so that y'all have
Thank
it.
you.
All right, God bless.
Bless you.
So that's for next week.
We are in Exodus next week, that's correct.
Okay.